am a pastor here at Grace Community Church in New Canaan, Connecticut. And so I oversee a lot of small groups. I have a master's in mental health, marriage, family, and a master's in divinity. And so I kind of blend those two together in a way where I do a lot of psychotherapy with people who have depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, you name it. A lot of divorce, obviously, a lot of kids who are addicted to opiates. I see a lot of them. And then the divinity side, again, small groups, preaching, teaching, discussions with atheists, agnostics. We are here at Grace Farms Foundation, which is kind of a blend of a foundation and our church, which it's a very interesting place to have a church because it was a very pricey purchase by the foundation of the church, as in, over 120 million. And
wow.
And so it's a good opportunity to engage people who are very liberal theologically, very liberal politically, very much into art and social justice. A lot of dance companies come out from New York City that are really gifted. And so you can kind of get the impression of the kind of people who are around here. And so to engage them in a different type of dialogue is fascinating. A lot of them are very angry that we offer some type of perhaps exclusive truth here at a church. But others are also very accepting. And so we'll get questions from time to time about why, if you're a church and you care about the poor, why are you meeting at such an expensive building, and how is the church connected in that kind of way? And it's a pretty easy response, but it's also, I can see where they're coming from. And I think ultimately the building meets the vision. And if that's the case, then it's workable. The foundation itself has eradicated, I believe fully eradicated, sex trafficking from the state of Connecticut, which is where we're at. And they are taking that on a global scale now, working with the UN. So just a lot of great stuff going on around here. And I do apologetics with my dad. We did University of Texas, Texas State. I did University of Delaware. He's at University of Windsor and Canterbury right now in Canada. And we got University of Minnesota that'll come up later. North Carolina, other schools. He's been doing it for 39 years. I'm fairly new to the scene. 5 years I've been doing it. And so slowly getting more seasoned, but I have a ways to go, but I love it. I think it's so important, especially on college campuses in today's day and age. In the 1990s, there was an understanding of truth was out there, but people disagreed on truth. Now people don't even think there's necessarily a truth or what is truth, or if it's an exclusive truth, and that's tremendously offensive. Then we also have the politically correct culture that we encounter with hyper-feminism to transgenderism, all kind of identity issues that are interesting discussions as well. And so on college campuses, gosh, especially at University of Texas, just a couple months ago, we had 400 students coming out at once to engage in dialogue. And so it shows that there's still a need and a desire. When I was at University of Delaware, a fire and brimstone guy, which most big universities have at least one of them, kind of on the outskirts, saying that all gays are going to hell, or really anybody who's not a Christian is going to hell, and he's going to determine who's going to hell, was there. And so University of Delaware was a little bit tougher for me to get a crowd going because they were turned off by him. But then we went indoors and it was a little bit easier. But we noticed especially those southern schools are very willing, and the students are very able to have intense, hard-hitting discussions at a school like University of Texas.
Awesome. So you have your master's. Are you going to go for your PhD?
Well, if I was in Europe, I would already have my PhD technically, Tom. 2 masters is the equivalent of, but sadly I'm not in Europe, so I would have a long ways to go to get that. And I don't know. I considered a doctorate in psychology after seminary, but I felt like I had different passions in a few different areas rather than just sitting on a couch, 8 hours, 10 hours out of my day.
Yeah, I can understand that. And you mentioned,
but there's so much integration between mental health and faith. It's scary. And I think biblical counseling and a lot of fundamentalist Christianity has done a disservice to even apologetics when it comes to the Christian faith, because it can be very narrow. I have also seen different examples of someone saying, why don't you pray out a depression, for example, or a bipolar? Now I think a lot of those things need to be medicated and there needs to be therapy. And And then I think, one of my closest friends, who's one of the most gifted psychologists I know, said that the Bible is hands down, and I don't know where he is faith-wise, but it's fascinating that he ventured here in saying that the Bible is the best psychology textbook that you could even begin to tap into. And so we have many coffees together, different discussions, but enough about me. How about you?
Yeah, so I mentioned a little bit about myself already. I am a member of the Campus Atheist Skeptics and Humanists at the University of Minnesota, and I do this as essentially my full-time job. I'm on YouTube doing conversations with apologists and professors from around the world about different reasons to believe in a God. I think it's a real shame that our two sides don't interact more. I'd really like to see more atheists going to Christian conferences and more Christians coming to atheist conferences. That engagement, I think, is really positive for both sides of the community to have these good discussions and really work through a lot of these issues. I think it's a thing that's missing in both sides, especially on the atheist side, because there's not very many of us for the most part. And I think it would be beneficial for everyone if we could really work together and have build the community as a whole.
Yeah, very, very true. Absolutely. And it's the most exciting thing imaginable. I had this 65-year-old guy come barging into my office the first year we moved in here, and he said, "Where's the chief philosopher here?" And I said, "Well, there's no chief philosophers, but we got a couple pastors in here. I'll have a discussion with you." And he looked at me and said, "You're a total sellout." And I said, "Why am I a sellout?" And he said, "Because you're taking part in some type of exclusive faith where you claim to have a truth, and you're deciding to live your life in such a way where you're abiding in Jesus Christ's teachings, and you even call yourself a Christian." And I simply talked to him further. It got intense. He talked about how Christians buy into infanticide and these sort of issues. But I looked at him and said, "You're an agnostic, and I think you're contradicting yourself right now, because you're a sellout in the sense of you worship the search." I mean, let's be quite honest. A lot of people are in that area where they'll say, the sun is setting, and every time you get close to the sunset, the sun recedes a little bit more. And so you'll never be able to get to the truth. That's kind of what God is. So we have a lot of people around here who would agree with that kind of analogy. But what they don't see is, everyone worships something. You can define worship however you'd like, but I think we know that I say worship. If you break down that word, it's worthship. What do you find ultimately worthy in life? And whether that's a job, a spouse, a girlfriend, you name it, everyone worships something.
Like your values and passions, the things you find meaningful.
Exactly. Yep.
Well, yeah, awesome. So, just jump right in. I mean, so I don't know what he meant by when he said you were a sellout. I didn't understand that. But that's a different topic. So, So I'm an atheist, by which I mean I don't believe there's any reasons to believe in the existence of a God, particularly the Christian God. Could you tell me some of the reasons you believe there are for belief in a God? And I'd like to tell you my position on those reasons, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts on my position.
Sure. So one would be a hunger for something more. Steal something from C.S. Lewis. When we have a hunger for lunch or dinner, there's food. When we have a desire for sex, there's a pretty woman or a handsome man that we could potentially have sex for. There's a thirst, there's a hunger. I think everyone has a hunger for there to be something more after this life, unless you're maybe mentally unhealthy. And so I think that's a piece of evidence for potential of an afterlife, an eternity, an eternal realm. Another piece would be my own personal experience, and even more so in our apologetics ministry, Give Me an Answer, which is our YouTube channel, Give Me an Answer. It's a lot of people. It's also a television show that is in a lot of prisons in the U.S. The type of people who have been murderers, rapists, majority of whom are more petty crimes than that, who have had radical transitions from a hardened life of crime to the Christian faith, a life where there's obviously the fruits of the Spirit are much clearer, and they buy into this type of truth, is phenomenal. It's absolutely amazing. Their own personal testimony, and I get to see it lived out because a lot of those people start coming to church here. So that's another piece, and you clearly see that obviously in the Gospels as well. Peter goes from Simon, which the etymology of that name is basically someone who's scared, to Peter, which the etymology is rock. He becomes kind of a scaredy cat to the rock that the very church is built on, tremendous courage. And I've seen a lot of people come to Christ, and that kind of life change has occurred. You see Doubting Thomas's life change. You see Paul, for example, Saul turned to Paul. Tremendous life change, going from just this towering intellect who was tremendously legalistic and murdering Christians to laying down his life for Jesus Christ based off of eyewitness testimony. And so those are two. A third one would be the moral argument. I oftentimes come back to the moral argument. I do think there's objective morals, and I've seen a lot of people come to faith through objective morality, understanding what it is and if it's real. And a lot of, obviously, poets have, and a lot of even celebrities have, through the moral argument. So I think that's powerful. The teleological argument, I believe that this universe is balanced on a razor's edge. It looks like it was set up. Some monkey was playing with the dials in such a way to prepare almost for human life, which is very strange to me. I think love, sacrifice, forgiveness, all connect to something more transcendent than simply a neurochemical reaction that pushes us again for something more. I think of consciousness. I think of evolutionary psychology connected to consciousness, our ability to reflect on what we are reflecting about, and from an evolutionary standpoint, like Steven Pinker, even himself an atheist, talks about, there's nothing in evolution to tell us that we should be what you and I are doing right now, being truth seekers. We should be taking part in survival of the fittest, and we should be wanting to preserve our gene pool, and we should be wanting to fulfill our top two needs of food and sex every day. But there's nothing in our evolutionary cycle, per se, or proclivities that should be pushing us to really be truth seekers. That one is kind of nonsensical without perhaps a logos out of John chapter 1 or logic based behind the universe that's calling us to a higher type of truth. So there's many more, but those are a few that kind of jump off the page or top of my head.
All right. Well, the first one you mentioned was a desire for something more. I mean, I desire to use the Force like Luke Skywalker, but I don't think that would be indicative of it actually existing. So how does the desire for something more actually evidence that there is something more there?
Well, I think simply the desire for something more is innately hardwired within us in a way that we are just endlessly hope-based creatures for something more. You look at prisoner of war camps, for example. I'm sure you know Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, the Shinton compound, and exactly the Shinton compound in Japan, what the Japanese did to like Eric Liddell and others, who we have so many personal testimonies on, those who talk about those who had a hunger and thirst for something more in life that buoyed them in such a way where they could draw meaning from that. And they were the ones who didn't live selfishly in those camps. They didn't become mean, and they weren't simply basing their lives off of their own happiness or ability to accrue comfort. Instead, they believed in something more that drew them outside of themselves, and that's what kind of kept them alive. And so, sure, to your point, exactly, I don't think that, the Force or anything like that, I don't think that's going to give us proof that there is something more. But why is there something in us that is we have this endless hunger and need for something more, and by having that need or buying into it, it buoys us and gets us through suffering.
Well, I'd say exactly that reason that you just presented is that it buoys us and gets us through suffering, which allows us to survive longer. And in the evolutionary process, the ones that survive longer are the ones that reproduce and keep going. And so that trait being a part of humanity seems to make a lot of sense from an evolutionary standpoint, rather than to say that there's actually something out there that we're striving to achieve. It seems to be more that the desire to achieve something gives us a motivation to survive where others may lose motivation. So it seems more reasonable from my perspective to interpret that desire for something more to be a product of what keeps us alive, rather than a product of it actually being there.
Sure. I could buy into that kind of thinking. If we were to make this more personal, when I go to the bedside of an atheist, agnostic, or Christian dying of cancer, there is typically, no matter what their worldview is, a hunger for something more. And to preserve themselves or because they want to meet their family again, you could take that from an evolutionary perspective and just say, well, they want to preserve themselves and they want that type of connection. But I see it as so much realer than that, so much more so of a desire where they are rationally, typically, the guys who are really thought out and the women who've really thought it out, where they do weigh other evidences and they would say, I feel God drawing me outside of myself, that there is some type of eternal reality. And then they would connect that often to near-death experiences. I think many near-death experiences are hoaxes, but you look at the studies coming out of Duke University right now, and there's 300 peer-reviewed articles talking about near-death experiences where people have actually been able to say the numbers that were written on sheets down the hallway in another room when they were pronounced dead on the table. And I know there was another study out of Duke University that I don't want to inflate these numbers. I think it was 20 million. Some say much more, but 20 million in India and Europe alone have had these type of near-death experiences and connecting to the eternal realm and having a hunger for the eternal realm. So could it be evolutionary based? Sure, but no, that's emotionally too personally, emotionally, physically, there's something more out there. I think we're all drawn to it and we truly want to desire. I think if we simply take it from your perspective, I don't think the evolutionary desire would be that strong. And you could look at it, I don't think animals desire maybe the hunger that we have for an eternal reality. It's probably very different.
Well, I would agree there. I'd say that the animals don't have the cognitive capacity to imagine an eternal reality, and so they can't use it as a justification. But I think that as soon as they gain that capability, they would be able to use it in the same way that we do, regardless of whether or not one's there, kind of like a cat heaven or a dog heaven, which I don't know if you would believe in that one or not. I definitely don't believe there is such a thing. But if we could give them the idea of that thing, it would motivate them in the same way that money would. If we could give animals money, they would use it in the same way we use it, as a means to get things that they value, because they can envision it as an idea in their head and then use that as a motivation. So, and we've seen studies on that where we have given animals money, essentially, where they can trade it in for food or other things, and they would essentially replicate human society in many ways in order to produce the same kinds of usually negative outlets of how they use the money and to manipulate and control others. And it seems like the same thing would probably be true of idealizing an afterlife. You mentioned near-death experiences. I'm pretty familiar with near-death experiences, and from my understanding, what happens in a near-death experience is that when your brain shuts down unexpectedly, like through arrhythmia or heart attack, what happens is that all of the access points of your brain are still functioning as normal. So they're essentially saving all of the information to your conscious memory, even though you're not conscious. Whereas normally when you lose consciousness, that part of your brain shuts down and it saves everything going on to your subconscious memory, like a dream state, essentially. And so when people lose consciousness through a heart attack and they're essentially dead for a period of time, everything that's going around them, like everything that touches them, everything they hear, those sensations are still saved as conscious memories in the brain, even though they're not conscious. And so when they wake up later, they remember these things as happening as if they were conscious experiences. So, for example, in the cases of people in hospital beds who were dying or having surgery or whatever, and they could remember things from other rooms, usually those could be explained by a nurse talking about the thing in the other room, going into the room with the person who was dying, and that memory, that vocal thing that went into their ear, was saved as a conscious memory, and that's how they kind of knew it was there, or how they could recall.
But the nurses themselves, that's the peer-reviewed articles, though, right? That the nurses themselves are making the claim that this truly did happen. I mean, even the most skeptical ones, at least the literature I've seen, have said, no, that's exactly right. I didn't talk about those numbers. There's no type of connection. And that's why they themselves have come forward as eyewitnesses.
Well, it's been tested a number of times. I don't think there's any confirmed studies of it not being explained by natural phenomenon, as far as I'm aware.
Well, what about these 300 peer-reviewed? You know the ones coming out of Duke right now, or have you not looked into them?
I've looked into a number. I don't know the 300. I don't know exactly what you're talking about, but I do know that there are. I have looked at ones from Duke, and as far as I know, the consensus in the field is vastly more. No, it's just natural causes. I believe I recently talked to.
I think it was just a couple of years ago, but I think the newest cutting research is slowly changing, because a couple of years ago, I never would have brought up near-death experiences. Even just a year and a half ago, I wouldn't have. So this is new, cutting edge. I think a lot of this comes, Gary Habermas. I can't remember the doctor at Duke right now, but Gary Habermas, if you were to connect with a lot of his stuff, he's the one who really talks about this quite a bit, these newer studies. But I want to go back to something, the more important initial question that you had. I would say, based off of that innate hunger we have for something more, again, that's not proof, and I don't even think that's one of the strongest pieces of evidence for there being something more, but I believe that emotionally, rationally, intellectually, that it does make sense, and I can see the evolutionary point of view. But how about just from a perspective? So I had some interesting discussions with college students this past month, and a couple of them did say, I don't want there to be something more. Now, whether they had depression, or whether they just had a hard life, or whether they bought into a new cultural narrative, let's say the Lion King, which is the circle of life, and it's totally natural to die, and death's not an enemy like Paul talks about in the Bible. It's just something that we should just kind of pretend like it's totally fine. And who cares if our loved ones get ripped away from us at an earlier age, or even if you live a long age, then that's beautiful. And I mean, what's wrong with death? Why be so scared of it? Why act like it's a big deal? Okay, fine. You can say that. Now let me ask you, though, if there is no judgment day in the future, if there's no ultimate judge, does that not bug you a little bit? That means whether it's the Hitlers, the Mao Zedongs, the Pol Pots, the Mother Teresas, the Billy Grahams, all of them just get clumped together. And so ultimately, the sun's going to die out, we're going to die out, entropy is going to continue to occur. And all of our good things that we've done in life, or our evil things, are just going to be equated as pretty much the same, and it truly doesn't matter. Versus an understanding, and if you do the studies coming out of, say, the Middle East or other war-torn countries, Miroslav Volf, we're connected with him here. He's probably one of the top 2 or 3 theologians in the world. He teaches theology up at Yale, and he made a great point to me once on how he lost a lot of family members in the Balkans. And he said, if you don't have an eternal life that people long for, and in that eternal life, in your theology, you have a type of judge, and you have a judgment day, then oftentimes what you'll have is this cycle of revenge will continue to go on in the Middle East or other war-torn countries, because people say this is secularism. This is the only life we have, so we have to get revenge. My father, I got to get revenge for him because he was killed by your dad, so I got to kill you because it's got to be revenge, and there's no ultimate judgment day. And he said, here in the U.S., we're so ethnocentric. We're in our cushy little homes, in our suburban areas where we can just kind of wax eloquent and think about these things in a very distant kind of way from a secular perspective. But he says, when it comes down to it, if you were in one of these war-torn countries, you would know exactly what I'm talking about. And so a lot of these students on college campuses, I have not heard a good response to that one yet.
Let me take it.
Each and every one of them said, you know what, that is a very tantalizing point, and I don't want there to be eternity because I don't have a lot of friends or loving relationships at all. But in terms of a judgment day, I absolutely want that.
Oh, well, yeah. So I would prefer if life here was eternal, or I could just have eternal youth or something like that, as opposed to having an eternal separate case. Maybe that was something like what they meant. But to talk about your point, I would say that most people who do have belief in an afterlife seem to be a lot more violent and a lot more retribution, have a lot more of that desire for revenge here and now than many of the secular places, like in Norway and Sweden and Denmark and Germany, all those kinds of places. In many cases, like the penalty for murder is like 12 to 16 years in prison. And then that's like the maximum prison sentence you can get. They're the most forgiving, compassionate people in the world, and they're mostly secular, mostly non-religious. It seems like the best way to end the cycle of violence is to have a worldview of compassion where this life is all there is, and therefore we should value every bit of it and every person in it as much as possible. And that kind of ideology seems to produce more compassion and kindness and getting rid of all the violence and the hate as more than any other ideology I think I've ever seen in the world, with maybe the exception of Jainism and extreme nonviolent Buddhism. Those two seem to be the most nonviolent of any ideology I know of. And so it seems to me that the places that do believe in an afterlife, specifically the Abrahamic religion, seems to be far more based on retribution across history. I know Christianity has moved far away from that in the more modern days, but in the past they were far more interested in retribution because of the rewards you could get in the afterlife from doing these actions to promote your God in some sense. So it seems like it works both ways, just like you want to have a judge in the afterlife and you're going to be judged for your consequences. Well, there's also a reward system in the afterlife. And so if you do certain things to gain those rewards, and those may not be, your interpretation of the Bible may not be such that those are good things to do, that this idea of there being an afterlife can motivate you to do both good and bad.
Most bloody century in our world's history, 20th century, I think no one would disagree with that. All those were atheistic regimes: Stalin, Hitler, Mao Zedong, other ones as well. And you could make the case for Mao Zedong. Almost 100 million people were killed, and all those atheistic secular regimes. Then I would go to, okay, it's an interesting point on the whole 12 to 16 years. That's more of a political point you're making there that we could go into on the jail sentencing and whether that's a type of forgiveness or what type of penalties are needed in those scenarios. I'm talking more specifically over the last 2,000 years. What do we see? Where do we get our universal benevolence? Why do we treat the poor a certain way? Why do we love people who are our enemies a certain way? Where does that all come from? And it comes from a religious structure of Christianity. Our nation was built on Judeo-Christian principles. So that's where it comes from. But back to the 20th century, Nietzsche said himself, God is dead. We've killed him. Now get ready for the consequences, the repercussions. He was prophetic, but he also saw it himself. And he said, what happens then is, not only, and you get Camus coming in as well, not only does modern man the only question he's got to ask is whether to kill himself or not, but also whether to kill other people or not, because this is the only reality we now have. And so that's why you have a Hitler ripping all of Nietzsche's stuff out and just using it all, stuffing his early faith, Christian faith, that I never truly believe he really had, but that one's been debated by many different scholars. And he said, Christians are weak. They're weak little boys and girls, he said, and we need to copy Nietzsche's Superman. And so, boom, there you have tremendous violence coming in. Now, to your point, though, I'm not disagreeing. I think you look at the Salem witch trials. I think if you look at the Inquisition, you can bring up different examples of religion doing horrendous things. And obviously with ISIS and new atheism was really spawned here in the U.S. after
9/11.
2001. Exactly. A lot of anger at religious fundamentalism. Okay, but let me ask you, Tom, have you ever seen an Amish terrorist?
No.
Okay. It depends on what your fundamental is. To just group all type of religion and the gospel into it, saying that all forms of religious fundamentalism, especially Abrahamic religions, where we're going to get certain, we're scoring goals for the afterlife, that somehow that always leads to violence. It's a dire and sad misunderstanding of what the gospel truly is.
Oh, absolutely. That's why I mentioned Jainism and Buddhism, because those are also religious, but they make people more pacifistic.
Sure. But there's examples of Hindus as well, and Buddhism going wrong too. And that's why when I debated a Muslim, he made the point of, well, it's just people. It's just people. Well, yes, it's just people to an extent, but it's also, what does your theology say? Muhammad, I think, carried the sword. I think Jesus carried the towel. I think Jesus died for his enemies. I think Muhammad, even though he had periods of peace in his life, also had many people beheaded and ended his life a very, very violent man. And so I'm just going to close with this. To your piece on religious fundamentalism and leading to violence, well, the most recent examples we have, I think, is the shooting at the Charleston Church, Dylan Roof. I think of the Amish, for example. That was what, 12 years ago, when that guy went into that little school and shot all those kids. Okay, in that scenario, you actually had the parents reaching out to the widow, having her over, paying certain expenses, having her over for dinners, saying, we're going to be there with you all life long. We forgive your husband in every way.